Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ryan Berg. I'm the director of the Americas program at CSIS, as well as the director of the Future of Venezuela initiative at CSIS. Thank you for joining us today for a conversation on operating in a hostile media environment in Venezuela. Before we formally begin, let's take care of some logistics. This discussion will last approximately 60 minutes. We will have simultaneous interpretation from English to Spanish and Spanish to English available during the duration of the event. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, please click on the globe button that says Interpretation and select the language you wish to listen in. Ahora para nuestra audiencia hispanohablante. Durante el evento tendremos traducción simultánea de inglés a español y a español a inglés. En la parte de abajo a la derecha en su pantalla de Zoom, verán un globo que dice Interpretation, en donde podrán elegir su idioma de preferencia. Please submit any questions you may have by clicking on the Ask Live Questions button on the event webpage, or right here on the Zoom screen in the Zoom Q&A section. Please note that this live stream discussion will be recorded and made available on the event webpage within 48 hours of this event. The recent media closures in Venezuela are one of the most detrimental challenges to an already decaying civic space under the Maduro regime. In 2022, the regime closed several dozen radio stations and further harassed print media. The regime has used ostensibly legal mechanisms and overt violence and intimidation to make arbitrary and unbalanced censorship the norm throughout Venezuela. An untamed hostility against television, newspapers, and radio outlets that do not run the regime's propaganda has made access to the news difficult for everyday Venezuelans. Indeed, with traditional media all but shuttered, the regime has systematically turned towards digital media to censor and curtail access to the news through targeted denial of service attacks and, in some cases, complete shutdowns. Yet with all these challenges, the Venezuelan people have been relentless in their pursuit of information. According to a 2020 poll by Transparencia Venezuela, 25% of Venezuelans rely primarily on social media to get their news, and social media is the main source of information for 39% of self-identified members of the opposition. While social media groups in Facebook, WhatsApp, and Telegram, to name just a few, present an opportunity for the opposition to evade censorship and get their message out to a significant number of people, they also present a clear and difficult challenge. The Maduro regime can more easily target these groups with disinformation about candidates, election dates, and polling locations. Furthermore, Russia, China, and Iran will most definitely help to amplify these narratives through their digital platforms, such as Sputnik and Russia Today. Many questions remain about the future of Venezuela's media landscape and its role in the upcoming election in the country. We have invited today a superlative panel to help us think through how a media space that is increasingly authoritarian in nature will impact the 2024 elections. This discussion will also delve into policy options for the United States and the international community to be able to support independent journalism in Venezuela's changing media landscape. I've asked each of our panelists to prepare framing remarks, and then we will move into a moderated discussion. Our first speaker is Carlos Correa, journalist and director of the NGO Espacio Público, an online platform that aims to promote and defend human rights, especially the freedom of expression and the right to information. He is also an advocate for social responsibility in social media. As a result of his work, Correa has been the victim of pressure, harassment, and threats by the regime. Espacio Público and Carlos Correa have participated annually in at least 4 international events, in addition to 30 hearings before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Our second speaker is William Newman, author and former Andes bureau chief for the New York Times while based in Caracas, Venezuela. He is author of a book that many of us have read, Things Are Never So Bad That They Can't Get Worse, a book that offers a deeply reported account of the collapse of Venezuela and what it could mean for the rest of the world. And our third speaker is Mark Feierstein, non-resident senior advisor with the Americas program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Feierstein served as assistant administrator for Latin America and the Caribbean at USAID during the Obama administration, and then as special assistant to the president and senior director for Western Hemisphere Affairs on the National Security Council. Carlos Correa, over to you for your opening remarks.
Muchas gracias por la invitación.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I will talk about three proposals and the diagnosis of what you were talking about, Ryan. What we have today in the media is the consequence of the policies and the traditional media and all the changes that we've seen around the world does not have the same influence and has more control from the system in Venezuela. So there are less newspapers, less TV channels and radio. Last year, they closed a number of channels and radio channels, and that has a great consequence because they're silencing all this media. So the information that we have, the quality information, does not circulate in TV or radio or newspapers. It goes through the social media. But we also get information that is not that great of quality, and that's what is happening right now in Venezuela. Today, to be able to get informed is a lot of effort for Venezuelans. And that makes them also responsible of verifying this information because they can get a lot of bad quality information and fake information. And they also have the responsibility to inform others. And that's what's happening right now in Venezuela. The people that can get informed, they try to inform other people, and they do it through structures that they trust. Someone that is a leader in the community will help the community to tell them that that's fake news, and they're going to circulate quality information. And in some way, they have to rebuild all this communication and try to build different dynamics so they can communicate and they can have quality information. And that's why we have one proposal, which is strengthening the capabilities of the society to verify information and distribute information at a local level. So the information that circulates has to be distributed, and people need to verify first that that's fake or real information, and they have to build different channels to distribute this information. And that's really important for the elections, but also other venues of participation at a local level, human rights, and of course to make complaints of human rights, and also humanitarian assistance. They need to have these communication channels to be able to be informed, even to participate in other events at a local level. So I think that's very important to strengthening the capabilities of society to verify and distribute information. The second proposal I think is key, and in Venezuela, some of the independent information goes to all projects at a regional level that are important too. El Diario del Tiempo, Diario El Caragüeño en Valencia, or Participeto. These are regional newspapers that in Venezuela were very important. More than 100 newspapers that we had at a regional level that had lots of importance. But these portals right now are still important, but more than 100 different portals have come up. And these are the ones that generate information that gets distributed through the social media. So we have to strengthening and also support this independent journalism. And we have to support this local information and these different dynamics through the traditional media that are rebuilding themselves. And then we have a third dimension that is also key because there's information portals in Venezuela. Most of them are blocked. So we are negotiating for the elections, and that's one of the points in the agenda. And we need to start requesting more spaces for the candidates in the radio and TV, and those are traditional channels. We will need to pressure, and we need to tell them that we need to unblock all these portals because we had more than 100 and half of them are blocked. So Conatel, which is the National Commission of the Media, is the one that has been blocking all these portals and closing these TV and radio channels. But these blocks make people to be able to join more sophisticated channels. So we have good news because in the last year, the media channels that have blocked have continued to work in the social media. And we also need to raise the prices of these channels because we have seen that there's a lot of repression, but not to the traditional media, but because they try to censor also social media. So we've seen lots of people that distribute information through WhatsApp or Facebook accounts. So we need to demand and pressure so that they process these people that are circulating this fake information. We need to make an effort to support this the people so that they keep verifying information, and also ask the international communities so that these things do not keep happening, or that there's some protection for the people that decide to inform. So I think that if we combine these proposals with the current diagnosis of these three priorities, I think that would be great.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for those opening remarks and those three priority areas that you've highlighted. Over to you, William, for your opening remarks. You're muted, William.
How about now? Is that good? Okay. Thank you very much, first of all, to Ryan and to the Center for the invitation to be part of this panel. And hello to Mark and Carlos. I wanted to start out by repeating something that Armando Briquet touched on a couple of weeks ago in a similar forum here, where one of the, obviously what we're talking about here is how the opposition can get access to the media. And there's, well, you know, Carlos touched on all the obstacles to that. At the same time, it's really important to have a message to get across. And I think that's been one of the real obstacles to the opposition, is to have a clear message. That's really going to depend on, in terms of looking forward to the 2024 presidential election, it's going to depend on who is the candidate that emerges, or more likely multiple candidates. But there will be one primarily unity candidate. And the message there is really key. And it is necessary for the opposition to find a message that's going to resonate. And, you know, you could have all sorts of access to the media, and if you don't have a clear and winning message, then, you know, you're not going to get across to the people you want to get across to. The other thing I think that we need to recognize is that the media space is completely captured in Venezuela today. When I first got to Venezuela in 2012, there was a really rich media environment. I mean, I was the correspondent for the Times there, and every day I had at least half a dozen newspapers delivered to my house. There were probably 12 or more newspapers that had broad circulation. There was a tremendous number of radio stations all across the country. There was Globovision, which had at least access in the major cities. And now all of that has disappeared. There are virtually no print newspapers left. The kiosks in Caracas, are pretty much bare. All those newspapers, because of the government strangling their access to newsprint primarily, went to the web, and then they were either blocked on the web or people don't have access to them for other reasons. But even back in 2012, for instance, when Capriles was running against Chavez, it was a completely unequal media environment, because the one TV station that reached all across the country was Channel 8, the VTV, the government state, the primary government station. And Capriles, as a candidate, essentially barely even appeared on that. I think in the last week of the campaign, you couldn't even see him on TV, whereas Chavez had blanket coverage. And that's still the case in terms of the government controlling television in the country. They still have VTV, and they have Telesur, and they have blanket coverage. And, part of their coverage is also to ridicule and tear apart the opposition at every opportunity, which is a kind of disinformation, which is institutionalized in the media space there. What's left, I think, to the opposition in terms of campaigning, when you think about political campaigning and the opposition getting its message across, they're basically down to social media. They're down to WhatsApp groups and Telegram, Instagram, that sort of thing. And I think that what we've seen, similar things happen in all countries are happening now in terms of political campaigns having challenges getting their messages across. And even in the United States, the people's ability to do that has changed completely. So what I think we've seen in countries in Latin America, and we'll see still or again in Venezuela, is massive WhatsApp messaging, text messaging, that sort of thing. But I think even more important than that is something that has been a challenge to the opposition, which is, and Carlos touched on this, in other words, what you're really down to is you're back to traditional methods of doing politics, which is direct human contact, contact in the communities, going door to door, what they call hacer territorio. I think that, a robust opposition would have a tremendous ground operation, because that's the way to actually reach people and get around the censorship. But that requires organization and enthusiasm. And at the moment, it's hard. It's impossible to know whether when we get to the campaign in 2024, whether the opposition will have the ability to do that. And then the other thing I wanted to touch on is that we talk about the difficulties of people to get access to the information, but equally important is the challenges that reporters face and journalists face in Venezuela. There's a tremendous amount of pressure and repression directed at journalists, both the continually reduced number who work at the remaining newspapers, and then also this sort of vast number of often younger journalists who are doing community journalism via Facebook or WhatsApp or Instagram. And there's been a lot of repression and pressure directed at those people. And so the fact that they're still out there and still doing it and persisting says a lot about their courage and the quality of those people. And I just think we need to keep in mind the risks that they run and the tenacity that they have in continuing to do their work in those conditions.
Thank you very much, William, for those opening remarks. Mark Feierstein, over to you for your remarks.
Well, thanks so much, Ryan. Appreciate the opportunity to participate on this panel. I don't have, unlike William, I don't have my own book to show off, so I'm showing off other people's books. But perhaps I can maybe step back a bit and put this discussion on the media in context. I think it's most encouraging that we're talking about elections. And I think that speaks to the really evolving convergence among the opposition and international actors that the 2024 elections represent the best option for advancing a democratic transition. Now, there are good reasons for skepticism that the regime will permit a credible election, including freer media, that would enable the opposition to win and take office. But recent Venezuelan history suggests that elections have actually proven to be the vehicle that has been most effective for the opposition in its efforts to counter the regime and make political gains. If we think back to 2007, when then President Hugo Chavez was advancing a constitutional reform, and that reform was voted down in a referendum in 2007. In 2015, the opposition won a supermajority in the National Assembly elections. Now, to be sure, that the assembly was then shut down by the regime, but those elections became the basis for Juan Guaido's recognition as president. And then, of course, in 2021, in the local elections, the opposition did fairly well. And that culminated in a surprise victory in the state of Barinas. Now, 2024 poses a very different test, obviously. The stakes are much, much higher. The very survival of the regime will be in play. And the conditions will certainly be worse than they were in 2007 and 2015, though I think certain factors might be, in the opposition favor relative to 2021. So 2024 presents an opportunity for the opposition to build on its past successes in elections. Now, the obstacles are many. There are political prisoners still. Some candidates are disqualified from running. Political parties have been taken over by the regime. There's questionable leadership of the Electoral Council. Millions of people are in exile. Those are presumably opposition voters. It's not clear whether they'll be able to participate in the elections. And then, of course, there's a topic of this session, which is that media outlets have been shuttered and censored. So I think this is a helpful discussion on how to improve the environment, how the opposition can operate in this environment. But I think it's important to put the challenge in context. Now, it is a given, and William spoke to this in terms of the history of how elections have been carried out previously in Venezuela. It is a given that there'll be a huge disparity in coverage, media coverage and funding. There is and there will be self-censorship. The state media regulatory agency will unjustifiably sanction stations. They're going to withdraw licenses. They're going to block websites. They'll run smear campaigns against journalists. And obviously, this is an authoritarian regime that will do anything to stay in power, including committing crimes against humanity. And the Maduro regime is going to take every step possible to control the media narrative and censor coverage favorable to the opposition. But that's true in authoritarian countries all over the world. But it doesn't stop mass mobilization. It doesn't stop political organizing. There are alternative means. There's social media, as we've been talking about. There's just the door-to-door work, the community organizing that both Carlos and William were talking about. So I think these obstacles can be overcome. I think the most inspiring and best example in the world today is certainly what's happening in Iran. But I think another question to evaluate is the extent to which the regime in Venezuela actually benefits from media control. And in Venezuela, the data suggests that despite all their efforts to control information, it hasn't helped them very much. Maduro's ratings are quite poor. His approval sits in the mid-20s. It's been there for some time. Now, to be sure, that's maybe higher than it should be, given the disaster that he's created. But, there's a Chavista base in Venezuela. There's an anti-American strain, though it's still a minority, but there is a base there. But I think it's important to keep in mind, people in Venezuela understand their reality. Things there are miserable, and they hold the government accountable. They don't buy, and the polls are very clear on this, they don't buy Maduro's case that the United States is to blame for the economic collapse. They overwhelmingly blame the government for the poor economic conditions. They don't blame the United States. They don't blame sanctions. They don't blame anyone else or the opposition. Now, all that said, we obviously need to take disinformation seriously. We've seen the impact it can have elsewhere, including in this country, in the United States. It's what, disinformation is what drove January 6th. It's what drove the recent assault on government buildings in Brazil. It's what led to the deaths of scores of thousands of people who refused to get vaccinated against COVID. So it's a serious problem. We need to take it, seriously. And the problem is growing. Yeah, and we're seeing, some media companies, taking the issue seriously. They're combating it. We're also seeing some regression. We have the head of Twitter now himself spreading disinformation and empowering those who propagate it. So I think the first step for the opposition to deal with the information, to deal with disinformation, to deal with their limited media access, and William spoke to this at the start of his remarks, is to create a reality that'll be harder to distort. And that means holding an inclusive primary. It means uniting behind the winner. And as William said, it means messaging that appeals to a broad segment of Venezuelan society. That's the first step. It doesn't really matter what means the opposition has to get their message out if they don't have a strong and effective message that appeals to a broad segment of the Venezuelan population. But I think if the opposition does that, and I'm confident they will, they're going to be well positioned to deal with all the obstacles the regime is going to put in its way, including on limited media access. So I think we combine that with the other steps that Carlos talked about, that William talked about. I think it can go a long way to mitigating the impact of a restricted media environment. And thanks again for the opportunity. I look forward to the comments of other participants and taking folks' questions.
Thank you very much, Mark, for those riveting opening remarks. I see we've got a couple folks already using the Q&A chat box, but just a friendly reminder, if you've got a question, you can either put it in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen, or you can ask live questions button, click that on the event webpage. I want to ask a question of all of you now that we're starting the moderated portion of the event about how you think the opposition is going to approach this new media environment. Let's assume that we get the most optimistic scenario. William spoke to the fact that there will likely be multiple candidates. Let's assume that we have a great primary. We have a coalescence around one particular candidate, and there is a primary that's inclusive. It's well put on. There's voting. In fact, even perhaps voting from Venezuelans who have left the country. How do you think the opposition is going to approach the traditional media environment in Venezuela to present that cohesive message? How much of it is going to be sort of engagement with traditional media versus how much of it is going to be forgetting the traditional media and trying to get the message out through social media and some of the other tools that we've seen can be double-edged swords, as you mentioned, Mark. So I think I want to hear from you first, Mark, and then I'll go back around the panel.
Look, I think it has to be an all of the above approach. I think they need to take advantage of whatever media access they have in state media and other media. Carlos talked about the local media. There may be more opportunities there than there would be obviously in the state-controlled national media. They need to do what they can, on social media, Facebook, WhatsApp, and such. And I think they do a fairly good job there. I mean, if you look at, most recently, there have been protests of public workers. And the opposition has really pretty much used social media to mobilize people there. So I think that is a sort of a good playbook, if you will. And, going back to the point that Carlos made and William made, I think the most important thing is going to be, community organizing, mass organizing. Look, even in a place like the United States, where we have plenty of free access to media, where there's just millions and millions spent on advertising, the most important thing that campaigns do is go door to door. I mean, even in presidential campaigns here, there were thousands of people canvassing, and it's been shown that the most effective way to persuade someone in favor of a particular candidate, the most effective way to persuade someone to vote, is to speak to them one-on-one. Obviously, the environment is very, very difficult in Venezuela. It's very dangerous for people to mobilize and to be active. But to the extent they have that opportunity, I think just a mass mobilization. And assuming that they get through a primary, they choose a candidate, and you have the entire opposition backing a single candidate. There are a lot of resources there. A lot of human resources. Ideally, there'll be potentially financial resources. And if you bring all that to bear on this election effort, I think it can have a pretty significant impact.
Thanks, Mark. William? You're muted again.
All right, sorry about that. A couple of things there. I was in Venezuela last in November, and what I've found then and then in other recent trips is that people are very anti-politics. People aren't particularly receptive right now. I think that one of the results of the whole Guaido episode is this tremendous amount of disillusionment that combined with just the wearing down on people of the daily survival and economic crisis. What I found talking to people, especially on the sort of lower end of the economic ladder, was a disengagement. People are fed up. They're really interested in sort of taking care of themselves, taking care of their families. They've disengaged from politics. They don't trust the politicians anymore. Certainly, they blame the government for the disaster, but they also blame the opposition for its many errors, and they just sort of see it as not a place that a solution is going to come from. Now, that's going to change, and as we get closer to a presidential election, people are going to re-engage. But that's also a real hurdle that the opposition is going to have in terms of reaching out to people. You talk about engagement with traditional media. I just think we have to understand that there is no traditional media left in the country accessible to the opposition. The opposition does not appear on television. The opposition does not appear on the radio. The traditional newspapers essentially have disappeared. And so it is primarily social media. I do think, I mean, it's been quite interesting over the last week or so with the teachers' protests and the protests at CEDAW. Certainly that information is getting out either by word of mouth or on social media. But the other thing is that, the scenario that you sketched out, Ryan, is quite optimistic, that there would be a primary that is well run, that results in a single candidate able to unify the opposition. When we talk about needing to go door to door and having a ground game, a real problem there is that there's, to my mind, a high likelihood that the candidate that emerges from a primary is not going to have sincere support from the other opposition parties. Whoever it is, you have this tremendous rivalry between all of the main parties and some of the main figures who are outside the main parties. And it's hard for me to imagine a scenario in which all the parties sort of get together and say, yes, we're really going to send our folks out to work to elect this person who we don't particularly like or support, even though, I mean, that's just a long running problem there. But supposing that they can get over that, I think the best thing that they can do is organize and be on the ground. Just this idea that somehow they're just simply not going to be able to reach people through television, through radio, that sort of thing, unfortunately. But it's not a new media environment. None of this is new. We've been dealing with this for years, even since before the crisis, even under Chavez, when they did have much more access. They were still completely outgunned in terms of the control or the domination of the media, especially on television. And you also have the cadenas. You have Maduro's ability at any moment to take over all the television and radio broadcasts in the country and get his message out. And as the campaign starts and the election comes closer, that'll happen more and more.
Thank you very much, William. Carlos, do you have anything to add here? Do you think that there's any chance that the opposition can get a message out in traditional media, or is it entirely social media and non-traditional media because the traditional media has been completely eviscerated?
No, creo que básicamente.
No, I think that it will go through the non-traditional media, and there are more spaces, more restricted, but there's been mobilization. In Cuba, there are less spaces and they have been able to mobilize. But when you study some of the mobilizations in Venezuela, even when there were still important media in Venezuela, there are some invisible channels that do not go through the traditional channels. And we've seen this with social media and other channels. But I remember to study organizations in 2007. There were huge mobilizations, and the articulation of the students didn't pass through the traditional media. It was through non-traditional channels. And these were repressed by the military. So there's a lot of circulation and it's very restricted, but something that is true is that thinking that they're gonna have one TV channel, that's very difficult because these are not projects that could be consolidated in 2 years. So it's very difficult to imagine that. And also because the dynamic in regards of communication has changed. The way that people communicate, it has changed for the electoral campaigns for a long time and also for the Venezuelan context. So I think that we need to train people because one of the problems of these new communication channels are this fake news. And this sometimes creates a lot of chaos because people do not know how to use this. So we need to have very good conditions in regards of negotiating so that the elections can happen. But to think that it's going to happen in the traditional channels is not going to happen. But I think there's an important point, and I think that the government is interested in having this scenario that they can rebuild themselves in some international spaces. So I think that this is something that we need to talk about and that they can guarantee some of these rights and have more spaces. And that's why I was saying that we need to combine these platforms with communication dynamics that are very different. Now in Venezuela, some of the key elements is that the Venezuelan society has, well, the culture of the political entity, they identify with democratic values. That doesn't mean that sometimes they are contradicting themselves and sometimes can be kind of religious or in favor of the authoritarian regime. But the main resistance that they have in regards to the authoritarian model. So that will, because I think that the society in Venezuela really wants quality information. And I think that the Venezuelan society is very uncertain. They don't know what's going to happen. And they're very upset, but I don't think that they have accepted the situation. I think that people are willing to take any chance to change some of the things that are affecting them. And people see in these elections some of these tools for change. And that's what I feel regarding the experience that we have at a local level, not only in Caracas, but everywhere in the country where we work. There's a lot of need of that. And also, I think that there are not lots of leaders regarding politics and the dynamic of communities. So it's true that it's a diagnosis, but it's also a great opportunity to work really hard so that they can put together all the need and the interests of the communities.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Mark, I think you wanted to weigh in on something.
Yeah, I just want to underscore something that Carlos said that I think is really important. And that's that the United States and other international actors use their leverage to try to improve media conditions in Venezuela. In the United States, we know that the principal objective of their policy is to improve the conditions for the 2024 elections. And they are prepared, the Biden administration is prepared to lift sanctions if the Maduro regime opens up political space. Now, that hasn't happened yet, but that's the intention. And, we know that Maduro desires legitimacy. He wants sanctions lifted. And the only way that's going to happen is via a more competitive election and the opening of political space in Venezuela. So I think there's a few things that the United States and others should be demanding, and that some of those things are obvious. More equal access to state media and to media more generally. Limited restrictions or no restrictions on websites. There shouldn't be arbitrary oversight of the opposition media or media that reports on the opposition. The law against hatred should be repealed. That's a law that is used really to restrict legitimate speech. And I think there are some sort of informal things that the opposition should be asking for as well. They should request a presidential debate, and that would be the best way for Venezuelans to see both candidates, the opposition candidate and Maduro, whoever the regime candidate is. We assume it will be Maduro, in an unfiltered way. Now, these are things that can be negotiated in Mexico. If the Mexico talks, finally get started, they can be negotiated privately between the opposition and the regime. Obviously, there is engagement in Caracas and elsewhere, or these are unilateral things that the regime can and should be doing. But again, if the regime is looking for number one, legitimacy, and number two, lifting of sanctions, it's going to have to take serious steps to improve the environment for these elections.
Thank you very much, Mark. And it answered actually one of the future questions I was going to ask, which was specific steps that the U.S. could demand to try to pull back the curtain on some of the repression against media. I think, William, you also wanted to weigh in here.
Yeah, I did. I just, as Carlos was talking, a couple of points that occurred to me that I wanted to make. One is, I think it's helpful to look at the regional elections in November of 2021, which were for mayor and city councils and governors in all the states. And there, it's been largely overlooked, but the opposition did extremely well. The opposition won in 126 approximately mayorships, whereas before they held less than 30. And while they only ended up winning 4 governorships in 19 of the 23 states, non-government candidates won a majority of the votes. The reason that the opposition didn't win more governorships was because multiple opposition candidates were running and they split the vote. And so that showed us a couple of things. It showed us a tremendous vulnerability of the government. And it also showed us that across the country, in every single state and in all of these municipalities, and one of the places that the opposition did really well often was in the countryside, where the opposition had been decimated in the past by Chavismo, where Chavismo used to be really strong. And so what that showed us is that people were out there doing old-fashioned politics all across Venezuela. These guys running for mayor didn't have access necessarily to TV or radio. They didn't have big budgets, but they were out there campaigning, meeting people, talking to people, and tapping into this tremendous unhappiness with the state of the country and the government. And the fact that they won so many votes in the countryside tells us something very important, which is that what had been an almost sort of unconscious or given identification of rural people with Chavismo has now been broken, or if not entirely broken, at least weakened tremendously. And so there's lots of openings there for the opposition. And there's a lesson there, which is that old-fashioned politics still works. Another point I wanted to make is that we talk about disinformation as though it's something new, fake news as though it's something new. But there's this sort of fundamental stream of disinformation that runs through Venezuelan politics during the decade that I've covered it and before, which is this idea, this very widespread belief that the vote isn't secret. Lots of Venezuelans, especially poor Venezuelans, working class Venezuelans, believe that the government can see who they vote for, and they're afraid that if they vote against the government, they'll lose their benefits, their services, they might lose their government job. Obviously, that's not true, but it's been a very effective theme that has worked for the government, and they've always encouraged it. So disinformation there isn't new, and it's always been an obstacle to overcome. And then the one last thing I wanted to mention is that I've been talking to lots of Venezuelan migrants in New York City who've been coming to New York over the last couple of months. Nobody talks about politics. This is a group of people that, to some degree, many of them have simply given up on Venezuela. They tell me, I don't want to go home. I want to stay here. I want to make a life here. And they're not thinking about, what will improve Venezuela? What are the politics of Venezuela? And, I think that also reflects something that we see on the ground in Venezuela, is this sort of deep disillusionment. Now, one can hope that the people who remained, person I talked to in November in Venezuela said, those of us who stayed are stronger because of what we've been through. And one can hope that they're stronger, and that they're also, when the time comes, they're willing to re-engage with politics and look for a solution there. And I think that the November 2021 elections did show us that people still see the ballot box as the way to resolve the country's problems. So people who stayed and who went to vote, lots of people went out to vote, and they voted because they thought that there was something to be gained by that. So.
Thank you very much, William. I want to get to one final question before we open it up to some of the questions in the chat box. And I do note that there are some questions, and we will get to those. And my question, it dovetails with some of the discussion we just had about disinformation. I don't want to take anything away from the regime. They certainly know how to engage in propaganda and disinformation. But I also want to ask a question about extra-hemispheric actors in the media environment in Venezuela. We know that Russia and China have both actively engaged in disinformation campaigns as well, in some cases bolstering pro-Maduro accounts and using bots to attack independent news outlets and opposition social media accounts. What can we expect in 2024? Will Russia and China come to Venezuela's digital aid again? And are there any strategies that you all would recommend for fighting this? And I'll start with you, Mark, and go back around the panel.
Sure, thanks. If I can just briefly comment on something William said, and I'll get to that. I think his point about people being fearful of that their vote is secret, I think just underscores the importance of voter education, of civic education. And, we've been talking a lot here about the opposition getting its message out. Arguably, the most important message they can get out is with regard to the process, with regard, how to vote, where to vote, that the vote is secret and such. Because if people participate, the opposition candidate will get the most votes on election day. But that's going to be the key, is because abstention has been a real problem for various reasons in recent elections. But if people come out and vote, if they feel secure about that their vote is secure, then I think that will be key for the opposition's success. Yeah, I mean, look, with regard to Russia and China, yeah, certainly they're going to come to the aid of the Maduro regime, and they already are. I think there's probably lessons to be learned, from how the United States has, combated Russian disinformation. Certainly the environment was better in 2020 than it was in 2016. Though it wasn't, perfect. And it's difficult for outlets to, effectively identify bots and restrict circulation of disinformation. But I think there is some progress. Though, as I noted earlier, I think, some media companies are making more progress than others, and some are going in the wrong direction. But I do think there are other things that, Facebook might be able to do, and others beyond just combating disinformation, is they could facilitate a freer media by reducing their fees, for circulating legitimate information, because that's often an obstacle for the opposition. There's also been a tendency for regime-supported users to identify legitimate information from the opposition as disinformation. And then, what Meta's algorithms will then reduce the circulation of that information or block it. And that's a real problem. So I think that, the companies need to do a much better job of, applying their algorithms, but also combining that with, with the human resources needed to understand the dynamic in Venezuela and, what's being blocked and what's legitimate and what, in fact, should be restricted circulation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mark. William, any suggestions about extra-hemispheric actors engaging in Venezuela's information space, in this case, disinformation?
I mean, just, responding to what Mark said, who's going to do that work of making sure that companies like Microsoft or Twitter are actually paying attention to what's going on in Venezuela? There's a lot of pressure for them to kind of fix their what's going on in the U.S. around elections or perhaps in Europe. But is anybody at Facebook or Twitter assigned the job of paying attention to political traffic, information traffic in Venezuela? It's hard to imagine that they're putting a lot of resources into that.
So I think my understanding, I think that they do. I think that all these companies have units in which they monitor the use of their platforms in tense environments like Venezuela. They all want to avoid their platform being used to advance crimes against humanity, to advance other abuses. So I think there's a question of effectiveness and the amount of resources they put into it. But I think, for example, in the case of Brazil, and I think there was understanding in the lead up to the Brazilian election, the kind of disinformation that Bolsonaro and his supporters were going to be propagating. And I think there was an effort to try to restrict that. Again, it wasn't perfect, as we can see. There's a lot more that can be done. But I think there is an awareness by some of these companies that they need to do more.
Okay.
I want to get Carlos to weigh in here, if he will, as well, because one of the three pillars that he outlined in his opening remarks was strengthened ability to be able to sort of bracket off disinformation from what is legitimate news. So any suggestions from Carlos or Espacio Público on how we might think about or deal with extra-hemispheric actors engaging in disinformation in Venezuela?
No, yo estaba pensando un poco.
Well, I was thinking a little bit on the line in the the election process to remember what happened in the election in Balinas, in the state of Balinas in Venezuela, meaning in an electoral process, they don't recognize the result. The candidate is enabled, and sometimes in the radio you could find out what was occurring from the opposition, and the opposition select a unique candidate and they give a consolidated message and they win the opposition. And this is a little bit to understand what we're talking about. That was in conditions that were not favorable. They didn't guarantee participation, and there were a series of limitations. And perhaps these conditions were worse, or it could be worse in future elections. But in any case, it happened, and there are events where the situations have been very asymmetrical. For example, the referendum in Chile to open the democratic process with Pinochet. I mean, there are restrictive processes that perhaps have been overcome regardless of the fact that they have been unequal and were not adjusted. And answering your question, there are international actors interested in intervene in Venezuela, and they are in fact doing it, and they are polarizing people, and they contribute to the polarization of the actors. They operate under their regional interest. But I believe that one of the things that is behind in the strategy of like having just or like dismissing the line of dismissing the election, that it exists. But the idea is that to convey that is still worth it voting, even though there are misinformation, because there are true facts, because you need to make, I mean, you have to underscore that, and the objective is that not to prevent that the idea that the vote creates change has to remain. So or every element that creates unity on the opposition, and for example, all the social media focus in Twitter, or concentrating Twitter, that is perhaps the one of the most important networks in the country, and sometimes the newspapers pay attention to that. And I think here is where we have to pay a lot of attention, and respectively give tools to people so that they can learn to sift the good and the bad, and to eliminate those informations that are perhaps have other interests that can harm the possibilities of that change. I mean, all of this, sometimes the misinformation is there with the objective of the political objectives that are coming from the Venezuelan government. So seeing this, you have to give tools to the people, because I think that the experiences of verification of information are fantastic, but sometimes it's after the information has already been spread. So I think you have to strengthen also the capabilities of people so that they can distinguish, and also to distribute quality information, because so that way we create an ecosystem. Of course, it's not the same or equivalent to the traditionals, through the traditional way of doing things, but it is a tool for the regular people.
The Q&A box rather has a few questions that I'd like to pick out and direct to individual panelists. So the first one is actually about, and I'd like to direct this to you, Mark. How can we protect media freedom through international institutions like the Special Rapporteur system at the United Nations, or some of the institutions that exist in the Inter-American system? What role do they play in getting us to a better overall media environment in Venezuela? That's one question. And then there's another question for both Carlos and William, presumably from a journalist. And so this is going to the two of you. Under these complex circumstances, what practical tips do you have for the coverage of the 2024 elections for foreign journalists? Are there any traps to avoid? So first, hear from Mark on the role of international institutions that have to do with freedom of expression and media specifically, and then I'll go to William and Carlos.
Sure, thank you. So I think there's a lot that international institutions can be doing. First and foremost is keep a focus on this issue. I think fora like this are very important to make sure people are aware. I think that puts some pressure on the regime. I think it's important for international press freedom groups and they've done a lot of good coverage, provide a lot of good coverage of what's happening in Venezuela. They need to continue to do that. I think assuming there will be international observers for the elections, and I'm hoping that the EU would be able to return. Media access, the lack of media access was a big focus of their last report on the 2021 elections. They laid out a number of recommendations. So I think it'd be important for them to continue to do that. And what the EU can do, it's a combination of both reporting on what's happening on the ground, making recommendations, but also diplomatic engagement with the regime about the kind of things that need to be done, the kind of steps that need to be taken. And then I think, there are international entities that can, provide direct support to journalists. And I think Carlos may have spoken to this earlier, providing trainings on digital security, on physical security, on, how to carry out, serious investigative reporting. I think all these steps, and these are kind of steps that have been taken in other environments. And I think a lot of this stuff is ongoing in Venezuela, but I think it needs to be ramped up in the next 2 years in the lead up to the 2024 election.
Thanks very much, Mark. William first, and then Carlos. Any advice you'd give for journalists covering the 2024 elections? Anything you would recommend that they avoid?
Yeah, two things. One is I think that just the very basic principle of journalism is go to the place. You need to get around the country. You need to be out in the street. You need to be in the barrios, especially. You need to get out into the countryside. If possible, get to some of the smaller cities and talk to people. I think that's the best way to get a sense of what's going on, how the campaign is going, and what's going on, when the election actually occurs. And then the other thing would be spend some time understanding the Venezuelan voting system. There's a lot of different levels to it. There are safeguards in place, and because it's pretty sophisticated and it actually works. I think that it's hard. Obviously, we don't know what's going to happen on election day. It's possible that an opposition candidate could get the largest number of votes, and if that does happen, we will know because of the way that the electoral system is built, the voting system is built. Or let me just rephrase that: we will know what the vote count is, regardless of who wins, because of the safeguards that are built in. And what happens afterwards or during the election to intimidate people, et cetera, is another thing. But it's important to understand how the voting system works, how it's been audited. Hopefully there will be a new audit of the software before the election takes place. There's the introduction of QR codes on the readouts of the voting machines was an important development in 2021. So it's important to talk to people and experts on the voting system.
Thank you very much, William. Carlos, your advice for journalists covering the election. You have the last word.
A ver, yo subrayo
Well,
un poco lo
I want to highlight what William said. I think that we need to rescue the reporters that are out there on the field. And sometimes these are based on information that are posted on the social media, but I think that Sandra, that is asking the question, knows what's going on. So I would say that this is important to stick to the very rigorous journalism and go to the field. And Ryan, I wanted to say something about the international organizations and how is that we've been using it to protect journalists in Venezuela. We have used some tools as measures, and we have taken cases to United Nations, and it works sometimes, and we have to obviously destroy that skepticism, but we've been able to protect the work of different journalists and their freedom, because sometimes they lack freedom, and the government, or we have to use this so that the government knows and understand the complexity of what's happening in our country. And that's why we go with people that want to make these official complaints, and we go with them, and there are lots of tools to protect them. And in the chat, they were talking about these tools and that they have been applied in Venezuela, but we need to pay attention. We obviously support people and tell them to say whatever they want, but in a smart way. But we also need to collect and join forces when they are persecuted. And this is a way that we can go further, and this is the main objective, that these voices can express themselves, and if someone is at risk, we can support the person so that they're not afraid and they can talk and they're not silenced.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Thank you to all of our panelists. What I've taken away from this event today is that there's going to be an emphasis on non-traditional outlets, but as all of you have highlighted, on traditional politics, ground game, going door to door, and mobilization. This has been a fascinating discussion. I want to thank all of our panelists, Carlos Correa, journalist and director of the NGO Espacio Público, William Newman, author of Things Are Never So Bad That They Can't Get Worse, and former Andes bureau chief for the New York Times, and Mark Feierstein, non-resident senior advisor with the Americas program at CSIS, and former senior director for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the National Security Council. Thank you all so much for being with us this morning and offering your insights. Take care.